All right, good afternoon. Today is Monday, November 23rd. It is approximately 3:23 p.m. My name is Leticia Medina. I am an interviewer with the COVID-19 Oral History Project, directed by Dr. Whitney Chappell at UTSA, University of Texas at San Antonio. And today my narrator is Patricia Castillo. Welcome, Patricia. Thank you for agreeing to the interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. It's my honor. Patricia, we're going to begin with just some biographical information. Could you tell me where you grew up and describe where you grew up?
Well, I grew up for the first 10 years of my life in the west side of San Antonio. The parish I belonged to was St. Timothy's Church, right there by 19th Street in Saltillo and Couples Road in Saltillo, right by the San Fernando Cemetery. And I grew up going to Catholic schools. I went to Catholic schools up until 5th grade. And my parents moved us when we were very young to go. My father had a job offer that he needed to fulfill in East Texas. So then we moved to East Texas. And so I spent a year and a half in East Texas in the Piney Woods in Nacogdoches, Texas. And that had its good and its bad aspects to it. And then we also moved from there to a little town in southeast of San Antonio called Nixon, Texas, and spent another, I think, year and a half, 2 years there. And by 8th grade, we came back to San Antonio and back to the same neighborhood, the same house that I was living in when, before we left. And which was inner city west side, puro barrio. And I loved it there. And my father wanted me to go back to Catholic school. And so it was in the summer, and he goes, I need for you to get yourself registered at, one of the Catholic schools, because, when summer's over, you're going to start up at another Catholic school. And so I'm like, okay, Dad. And so I didn't want to go back to Catholic school. And so I didn't call nobody. And I just told my dad that nobody had space. Sorry, Dad, all the slots are taken. And he goes, what? And I said, all the slots are taken. There's no space at the Catholic schools anymore. And he goes, no, hombre, no me digas. And I'm like, hijo, que gacho, right, Dad? And he's like, no, yo quería que fueras a la escuela católica. And, I'm sorry, Dad, pero ya no hay lugar. And he goes, bueno, pues ni modo. And so, I went to go register at the middle school down the street, which was at that time Edgewood Junior High. And it was at that time considered, Edgewood district was considered the worst district in the nation for students. And I was in the 8th grade, and they were studying multiplications that I had gone over in 5th grade, and English that I had gone over in 5th grade. And so, needless to say, I was always in trouble because I was bored to death. And it was like one of the perfect schools that was very conducive to trouble. And so I stayed in trouble. And finally, my history teacher called my parents and said, look, this kid is really smart. You need to put her in a school that challenges her, because clearly this one doesn't. And if you don't do that, you're going to lose her to the streets. And like within a week, my dad bought a house in North Side District, and we moved like in a week, seriously. And, I was at Anson Jones Middle School in the North Side District, and I needed a tutor because I didn't understand. They were like doing geometry and calculus in the 8th grade. And I was like, what is this? Like, I had no idea. And so I needed a tutor. And so for the remainder of the year, I had a tutor, and somehow I was able to pass, to the 9th grade. And so I ended up graduating from John Jay High School. And I was really mad at my parents because I was looking forward to graduating from John F. Kennedy High School. That's the high school I wanted to graduate from. And so, that was a running, fight that my parents and I had, that they got me away from John F. Kennedy High School. But I ended up graduating from John Jay, and it was an interesting move as a kid, because I moved over here to quote unquote El North Side, right? Mm-hmm. And but there was a lot of trouble in this side of town too. And I moved into the area right here by Lackland, right? By Lackland Military Air Force Base, right? And a lot of the kids were from military families that I went to school with. And these kids were super into drugs and super into alcoholism, and, and that was really challenging, to be around, because everybody was doing drugs. Everybody was involved, in some kind of substance abuse. And so that was a big deal, of dealing with stuff in this neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And, but, we managed to graduate, we managed to finish. And I'm glad my parents moved us, because we ended up going to better schools and stuff. And it didn't really even matter, like in terms of going to college, because that was not my plan. My plan was to join the military right out of high school. And I had already been seeing recruiters and everything. And I had, I was one signature away from belonging to the Army, one signature. But what I didn't know was that my father was developing my plan to go to Our Lady of the Lake University with the financial aid officer from Our Lady of the Lake University. And I had no idea. I knew that some guy named Sam Sanchez was coming to my parents' house and meeting with my parents, but I didn't know for what, I didn't know what they were talking about or anything. And apparently during that time, the financial aid officers did that kind of stuff. They'd come and meet with the families, Girls, so when I graduated from high school, it was funny. They call my name, right, to go get my diploma. So they say, Patricia Castillo has been awarded a scholarship to attend Our Lady of the Lake University. And I was like, what? I had no idea.
Wow.
I had no idea. And so, all my friends, I hung out with all the dregs of high school. Like, I hung out with all the potheads, all the acid heads, I hung out with, those were my people, And so when they announced, that I've been awarded a scholarship to go to Our Lady, oh my God, all my friends fell out, woo!
That's wonderful. I mean, it's wonderful that you had
that it happened, right? Mm-hmm. But I mean, at the time, I had no idea. I was completely caught off guard, and so I get up to go get my diploma, and they take a special picture with me because I got a scholarship to Our Lady of the Lake University, and I mean, I made C's and D's, in high school. I mean, I was not a good student. And I mean, because most of the time I was taking care of my friends, that were doing drugs, and they pop acid in the morning, and then you have to hold their hand all day at school. And what, I was a social worker in high school, and so And then little did I know, I ended up going to social work school, right?
Wow.
But yeah, that's how my childhood ended up,
That's
and
incredible.
my father was like, because I was telling my father, Dad, I'm going in the army. He goes, no, señorita, usted no va para ningún army ni que sus patas, and and I'm like, but Dad, and he was like, no, you are going to Arley de Lake University, and that's all there is to it. I don't want to hear another word, and so I was like, bueno, pues ni modo, right? And so needless to say, I was kind of mad at my dad because he was controlling my life and I was already like an adult, right? And so, but ultimately I did get to tell my dad that he saved my life, because who knows what would have happened to me in the army. I mean, you hear all the stories now of what's going on with women in the army and the military and what's happening to them. And y luego yo que soy bien rebelde, que para mí tengo que, why? Y que why? Why do I have to do that? And for what? And you can't do that in the military. You just say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. That's it, and shut up and do it.
That's it. That's it.
So he did. He saved my life, my daddy. Go ahead.
So maybe you answered this next question. What I'm asking is, what or who has shaped your life the most?
Well, clearly my family life has, my family life, our parents loved us very much. They were ignorant in terms of, how to raise children, right? Because they used to hit us a lot, right? That was one of the things that they were really ignorant about. Just pura falta de información, right? And back in the day, nobody went to parenting classes. Who went to parenting classes back then? And in the 60s, nobody went to parenting classes. And so to them, that was what they thought they were doing us un bien, right? By disciplining us with corporal punishment. And so, pero, I never once doubted that I was a loved child or a wanted child. I never doubted that. I never questioned that. And I had a good extended family, like my grandparents were always there on both sides of my parentage, right? Bueno, mi maternal grandpa no, porque él siempre andaba en las piscas. He was always in the, worked, he was a farm worker, and he managed a crew of people that was always picking, fruits and vegetables. And so he was always gone. But when I did see him, he was good. So I had a good family life like that. And my dad was one of those kind of dads that he always wanted to make sure that we had good experiences. Like he would take us to parks, he would take us to all the fiesta events, he would take us to the lakes, to the rivers, to the, to swimming, to, Starkey Park, Landa Park. He was always taking us somewhere, and making sure that we were having fun, and barbecues here and barbecues there. And, he was one of those kind of dads, right? That he wanted his kids to have good experiences. We were also members of the Good Samaritan Center, which is an Episcopal social service agency on the west side, right there on the corner of 19th and Saltillo. And so we were always there too, that center offered like all kinds of services, right? It's really weird because like I grew up in that Good Samaritan Center. Never once did I know it was an Episcopal agency, like an Episcopal church agency. And then in my 30s, I converted to becoming an Episcopalian. And I didn't know that the Good Samaritan Center, had been an Episcopal agency all these years, right? until one day my friend Carmen, Reverend Carmen Guerrero, she goes, "You want to go to the blessing of the new wing at the Good Sam?" And I'm like, they're adding a new wing. And she goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, why are you going?" She goes, "Because that's an Episcopal center." And I'm like, "What?" And she goes, "Patricia, you didn't know that?" I'm like, "No." So here I had been influenced by all these Episcopalians my whole childhood, you know, until I was like 10 years old. And I had no idea, you know, I had no idea. And then in my 30s, I convert to becoming an Episcopalian and find this out. It was so weird. Anyways, and they were good. You know, I learned how to dance there. I learned how to sew. I learned how to cook. I learned how to, you know, like swim. They would take us to swimming camp every summer. I learned how to ride horses at camp. You know, I learned all these things as a kid, and my parents made sure that we were involved in all of that stuff. You know, as much free time as we had, they kept us busy in all of those things. You know, so that was, I mean, you know, I loved my childhood. You know, we had a lot of fun. You know, we played in the street all the time, you know, but it was right there in front of my mom's house, you know. And so we were all, our street was a short residential street. So everybody knew everybody. And all the kids all hung out together, and we all went to the same Catholic school together. And, you know, the one of our parents they would throw all of us in one station wagon and take us and dump us at the Catholic school. And then at the end of the day, the same station wagon would come pick us up and bring us all home, you know. And so, you know, that was all very good and very positive. And then my grandparents were the same. You know, my father's parents, they lived down the street. And you know, they were always very good to us and very kind. And igual, you know, a lot of fun, a lot of cooking, a lot of good times, a lot of, you know, wonderful, wonderful times as a childhood with my grandparents.
It sounds like a lot of convivio, a lot of drawing from each other.
All the time. And my grandmother was like la mera mera de la Catholic Church, the St. Timothy's. And so, you know, we were always involved in all kinds of church activities too, you know, the cake sale, y la Jamaica, y like, you know, there was always something to do and something going on, right? You know, and so those were all good experiences, you know, very nice, good experiences that that I had. And I didn't start fighting with the Catholic Church until I grew up and like learned stuff, you know. And that's when I left, you know, that's when I just quit going, you know, when I got older. And, you know, and I rejected it, you know, I rejected the Roman Catholic Church and ended up at the Anglican Catholic Church, you know. And it's okay, you know, I'm good there, you know. And although I did reject organized religion for many years, I didn't have anything to do with it for many years. And then I met Reverend Carmen Guerrero, and that just totally like floored me. What? You know, a Chicana Episcopalian priest? Oh my God, you know. And that floored me, right?
So this core, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
It sounds like you also grew up with like a core belief in service.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, because of my grandmother's influence. Because of my grandmother's influence, you know, she was always doing stuff, you know, like for the church. And then I was always with her, you know. As a kid, I was always with her. See, the thing was that my mom was kind of afraid of my paternal grandmother, because she was a doña, right? You know, she was a big old doña, and nobody questioned her, nobody challenged her. And so when she would show up at my mom's house, you know, and my dad was at work, my grandma would say, "Vine por Patricia." And my mom was like, you know, yeah, you know, aquí está, llévesela, you know, like she didn't, you know, like question my grandmother, challenge my grandmother, you know, está dormida, or está, you know, está ocupada. No, Aquí está, señora. You know?
So tell me a little bit about how that growing up in with that core belief of service led you into what you do now.
Well, I guess, that was the lane of the foundation, that was the lane of the foundation. And then I think also having been having the influence of the Good Sam also was part of that too, because I was at the Good Sam, there's the pre-kinder, and I participated in activities at the Good Sam until I was 10 years old when we left, so you could see at the Good Sam, how all the kids from the neighborhood, benefited from the services that they provided to us, right? Mm-hmm. My mom got all her prenatal care there. We got all of our dental care there. We got all of our, everything we needed, was llámale al Good Sam, and so we would get everything there, right? And they would help people, right? And, plus, educate us, right? Nos educaban, with classes, and with activities, and, que tuviéramos mucho diferente conocimiento, right? Mm-hmm. Go learn about the rancho, go learn about the horses, go learn about swimming, go learn about canoeing, go learn, todo nos enseñaban, and so all of that was also part of that influence of service and participation in community, right? Mm-hmm. Participation in community and then of course being with my grandmother, I was always with my grandmother and she was always doing something, right? Doing something for the priests or doing something for the church or doing something for the neighborhood. Like my grandpa was the only one that worked at Kelly from that neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And so my grandparents had TV and had a telephone. And so everybody would come and, either come to watch TV programs at my grandma's house or borrow the phone. And she would let them, she would, to her, it was like, sí, claro, pásale,
Yeah.
And so, that was kind of like, her generosity was, you could see that there too, her giving to the community and her openness, to helping in the community. So mm-hmm. Yeah, all of those things were influential in terms of laying my foundation about, understanding how to be a member of community, how to serve community, how to live in community. She taught me all of that. She exposed me to all of that. And that was good. That was good. I'm glad she did. Yeah.
How do you serve your community now?
Well, every single job I've ever had, has had to do with, service in the community, right? And then of course, mainly focused on addressing the issues of family violence. And so, that's a pretty big issue that, a lot of people, not everybody wants to be involved in that, right? It's not an easy issue, it's not, warm fuzzies, right? And so, but I don't know, I just have always been attracted to the work. And I feel like to me, it's like addressing issues from the root. When you work in family violence, and if you can keep a family from experiencing violence and taking a different way, assuming a different way of life, then you're helping that family in all other aspects of their life. And, to me, that's the way I look at it, that when I'm helping somebody get themselves out of a situation of violence, every aspect of their life is going to be better. Mm-hmm. Not only for the victim, but also if there's children in the picture. And so, that's how I see the work that I do, with regard to family violence.
So My question to you now is, how was your work impacted when this pandemic broke back in mid early March, right around that time?
Yeah. Well, it made, you know, it, you know, the work has been diminished in terms of numbers, but in terms of the levels of violence that I see and hear about by way of phone calls, crisis calls, what we refer to as crisis calls, is much greater.
Oh, wow.
And I think that, you know, the way they call it, el encierro, has, you know, the quarantine has facilitated a lot more levels of violence to, you know, be exposed and to come forth, you know, than before. And so, you know, you just hear a lot more cruelty. They're just, it's more terrorizing and uglier than what I had been hearing about before.
Oh gosh.
And so
I'm sorry about that, but
it's terrible. It's terrible. And it really has diminished, you know, people's capacity to help themselves. You know, people feel real, they don't want to go to the shelter. They're afraid of going to the shelter. They feel like, you know, they might get sick if they go to the shelter.
Yeah.
To go live with people they don't know, you know, and so they remain more vulnerable, you know, if they go to family members' homes or sisters' homes or neighbors' homes, you know, and that's if they'll take you in, you know. That's the other thing, is that, you know, your family's like, they don't want to take you in because they're scared too, you know. And either they're scared of the virus, or they're scared of the perpetrator coming and doing damage at their house.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard right now for people that are living with this type of violence in their life, and they feel like they have a lot less options. And and in terms of the resources in the community, I mean, some of them have gotten a little bit better, you know, because of all the funding that has come down to help communities with the virus and the impact of the virus. But, you know, so you get an extra 10 days from a hotel. You know, what's that?
Yeah.
You know, when the 10 days are up, lo que, you know. And so that's, you know, that's hard too. Anyway, so it's been very difficult.
Yeah. How did you feel personally? So beyond work or aside from work, how did you feel personally when the pandemic broke in mid-March?
Well, at first I was feeling very like, we can do this virtually, and, you know, because that's kind of like my nature, right? Like, si se puede, right? You know, and to have that kind of attitude. But um, it's, you know, I do feel, you know, like I've been cut off at the knees, you know, because you just can't work at the same level, and you don't have the same level of impact virtually as you did when you have people there in front of you. And you can hug them, and you can hold their hand, and you can bring them a box of tissues and a glass of water, and you know what I'm saying? You're just not as effective, you know, as you are face to face. And I really feel that because I am very much hands-on in terms of my work as a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And even, you know, being the executive director, I have never given up doing the hands-on work. In, you know, the 40 years that I've done this work, I've always been, you know, right there with the clients, you know, with the people we serve. And it's one of the things that, you know, is tremendously, you know, diminished by this pandemic. And so that doesn't feel good for me, you know.
When did you realize, when did you feel that your optimism kind of shifted to feeling like, wow, this is not, I'm not having, you said, the same level of impact? When did that happen?
I think I started feeling it around like in July, August, por ahí.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it took a while for me to, because we went virtual like around March 20th
Mm-hmm.
is when we went virtual, around, you know, mid to late March. And that's when our board, you know, told us go home and stay there, you know, don't come out, do everything from your laptop, take whatever you need, you know. And then we've had some help too, like the Texas Council on Family Violence set us up to receive a grant from the Houston Astros Foundation. And they gave us almost $7,000 to set up like the virtual space that we need to do our work. So, you know, I got a bunch of very fancy, very nice new, you know, technology and all of this stuff, pero como quiera, you know, no es, it's nice, and, you know, I'm glad I have it, pero it's no es igual, you know, no es igual.
Mm-hmm.
So we just have to keep, you know, trying to make it effective, you know, keep talking to people, keep reaching out to people, keep taking their calls, keep responding to them. You know, we just got to keep at it no matter what.
You said something interesting earlier. You said that in terms of numbers, you've seen the numbers diminish, but the severity of the violence has increased. So when you say the numbers have diminished, you mean less people are, for example, calling into the hotline? That, okay. But what the ones that do call are reporting more severe levels
more
of
more cruelty.
Wow.
Higher levels of violence.
Wow.
So it makes me wonder what's happening to the ones that aren't calling.
Oh my.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What are they going through? You know, the ones that aren't calling.
Yeah. Gosh. So how do you predict that, or when do you predict that things may go back to normal? And by normal, I mean what you were seeing before.
You know, I'm going by what is being said from the CDC, and they're looking at 2022.
Right.
You know, that's what they're telling us. And people that are connected to the CDC are saying, you know, maybe by 2022, you know, things are going to get back to functioning, you know, the way it used to be, at least logistically.
Right.
But I don't know, that's a lot of time for a lot of damage to be done.
Yeah.
So
yes, though we couldn't predict how any of this would have played out or would be playing out. When the pandemic first hit, that early March, what concerned you most about coronavirus? What was the thing that was just worrying you the most about this entire situation?
Well, I guess, that I would get sick.
Yeah.
That's been my biggest fear is I don't want to get sick. I want to stay healthy, and I want to keep doing what I do, even though it feels, like I'm only like 50% effective in comparison to what I could do before. Um, and I mean, I'm lucky to continue to have a job, right? That's the other thing, is that I'm grateful for being able to still work, even though it's been, you know, totally different and totally changed. Um, but um, I guess that's the main thing, is that how do I stay healthy? How do I, continue to be a resource? How do I continue to be a voice? How do I continue to be active and involved in whatever is going on in my community that's addressing issues of family violence? And so, um, and we've continued to meet, we've continued to plan, we've continued to talk about what needs to be different and what kinds of things can we do differently. I mean, all of that has continued, but it has also been clearly impacted. Um, and so um, we just have to try to get done as much as we can under these conditions. That's all we can do.
Speaking of experts saying that it's maybe 2022 before we have some sense of normalcy, how do you feel that local leadership has handled the pandemic? What has local leadership done, um, in your opinion, to effectively handle the pandemic?
Well, I kind of feel like, their hands have been tied by the governor. Because, the governor comes after whoever doesn't listen to what he says. And so locally, I feel like our local leaders want to do more, like, for example, make it mandatory for everybody to wear masks and things like that. But, if they try to issue that kind of a policy or approach, then the state government comes after us. And that's very frustrating, and that's very, to me, it angers me tremendously, because I feel like we need to do what we need to do to save lives, and I mean, we can't drive drunk. We have to wear seatbelts. You can't smoke in public. We've got all of these rules that we have to abide by because we know it saves lives.
Right.
So what the hell, like, what is the problem with telling people you have to wear a mask to protect yourself and protect others? And I just don't, I don't get it. It's about the common good. That's what should be uppermost important, in everybody's thinking, that how do we protect each other? How do we help save each other's lives? All of these things that, we know work. If we know they work, what is I don't know. It's just very frustrating to me, all of this stuff. And
yeah, leadership has definitely failed the citizens of this country. on different levels. Besides wearing a mask, how has COVID-19 changed your daily life? What do you do now that you didn't do pre-COVID-19 or pre-pandemic?
I don't go to the grocery store. I order all my groceries um, online, and I have them delivered. And it takes me a good, hour and a half to um, clean everything that comes into my house with bleach. And I wear gloves and I wear masks the whole time. And I very rarely go into other kinds of stores like the drugstore. Maybe I've gone once a month to the drugstore. Um, uh, I think I've been to Ross twice since March, because I would go there to buy, stuff that I need, right? And I just, I feel like it's so unsafe, and I don't do any of my activist work. Like I was always out there in all the marches, all the protests, I was always out there, and, I'm 62, I have diabetes, I'm fat, like I have to take all of that into consideration now that, if I go out there and get something, then I'm very vulnerable to die, and so I can't do any of those things anymore. I don't do them. And that's heartbreaking to me because, I feel like it's important and valuable for people to be doing it, especially right now, right?
Right.
And I don't see my family. And I miss them. And then they get together and I can't stand it because why are y'all getting together? You're only supposed to be around people you live with. And so I spend a lot of time dreading that, because they do get together, and they see each other, and um and we have had a couple of like close calls in our family where, people have been exposed. And so, all of that is I hate living like that, with a lot of dread in my body. And um it's just me and my dog,
Yeah.
and so
Have you gotten a COVID-19 test?
no. Mm-mm.
No.
Mm-mm.
I had to have one when I got back from Russia, but um, yeah, it's it's
You've
these are
only been tested that one time.
just that's it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's you and your dog. So what do you do? I've seen your cooking videos. You do like little short videos. What do you do besides get better and better at cooking to pass the time since you're pretty much self-isolated?
Yeah. Well, I spend time doing whatever I can virtually, online, with people. And I go to my meetings virtually. I stay in touch that way with folks. I read a lot. I watch a lot of PBS. Um, I and like I don't have like Netflix and all of those. I'm not like that kind of a person that has like, I don't even have cable TV. Like I don't have cable. I don't do all of that. I'm not gonna pay for cable, tan locos, right? and muy apenas tengo internet. I just got internet at my house because my hotspot was just, you know, it felt like it just kept getting weaker and weaker, right? And then I'd run out of, you know, hotspot, you know, megabytes, and so then I would, you know, couldn't be on it longer, or it would slow it down tremendously. So I had to break down and order internet, and but I figured, you know, how could you not have internet when you have all this fancy equipment, you know, and and so ni modo, I just said hell with it. So I go to church virtually on Sundays, you know, and that helps. You know, my church is doing virtual services on Sunday, and I do Zoom calls with my sister, and you know, I just.
Do you have argument? Do you and your sister have arguments about getting together?
You know, I get mad about, you know, her doing stuff because she posts pictures, you know, of the get-togethers that she has with her friends and stuff, and I'm like, and then my other friends, right? They'll call me, "Did you see Alma's pictures on Facebook?" And I'm like, "Yes, I did," you know, and so. Man, isn't she scared? And I'm like, I don't know. She just keeps doing it, you know, and anyways, and so she had this birthday dinner in November at Sorrentina, at La Sorrentina. Have you ever been to that little restaurant? And then the little room in the back is even smaller.
Tiny. Oh my God.
So she had a dinner party in La Sorrentina, and she's like, "Are you going to come?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not coming to that. You cannot socially distance in that space, Alma." And you know, she was like, "Well, we're only going to be a few of us, and nah, 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 nah," you know, and I'm like, "Oh my God." I said, "Look, Alma, I'm not going." So le ordené un cake y se lo mandé, y, you know, que les vaya bien, you know, and happy birthday. And what can you do? You can't do nothing, you know. And so, pero sí me enojo y sí me frustro, you know. And I call her and I told her, I said, "Alma, are you sure you should be having this party? It's not a safe space. It's not a place where you can socially distance." You know, and she was like, "Well, I guess what I can do is I can poll my invitees and ask them if they're uncomfortable coming." And I said, "Okay, well, you know, algo es algo, right? That's all you can do, right?" And
maybe I already know the answer to this question, but what are your plans for Thanksgiving?
I'm gonna be in my house.
Are you cooking a Thanksgiving meal, or it's just gonna be another day?
No. My friend Catherine said, "Come by the house. I'm preparing a plate for you. I'm making a big old meal," because she's married and she has 2 kids, and her brother's coming over, and her nephew or niece or something, I don't know what. And so she goes, "I'm making a big old meal, and so you drop by and I'll hand you a plate." And I said, "Okay," you know. And then my friend Chris también, she goes, "I'm gonna be in my house by myself, but I'm cooking a turkey, girl." And I said, "Good for you." And she goes, "Yes, I'm cooking, and I'm gonna have all the trimmings. So you pass by here and pick up a plate." So there's 2 plates of turkey that I'm getting. Listo. But I, you know, I'm not gonna go visit. I'm not gonna go hang out with anybody. You know, that thing is airborne, man. It's too scary. So I just
terrifying.
You know.
It's terrifying. And then where do you, I was gonna say, I just was listening to the breaking news from CBS News about the latest COVID-19 update. Where do you get your news? Your COVID-19 updates. Where do you go to?
Whatever I see online, I check out the news online. I watch the news on TV. And I mostly on that kind of stuff, I listen to national news, whatever is being said on national news. Mm-hmm. And I just get it from the major networks, right? ABC, CBS, NBC, Univision, I watch that stuff. And then whatever I can read online también. Like yesterday, what they were today, this morning, the new news, no? One death every minute.
One death every minute.
One death every minute in our country. And that's not good.
It's alarming. It's terrifying.
It really is.
You said earlier that you've had some close calls, but no one close to you has gotten sick from COVID-19?
The only person that got sick, and I don't know, they say it wasn't COVID-19, but I don't know, because it sure did sound like COVID-19, was my cousin's husband. And he says that he took 3 COVID tests and all of them came back negative. But he was told to quarantine, and he had to quarantine for 2 weeks. He had high fever, like 104. He had lost taste in his, taste and smell. He couldn't smell anything. He couldn't taste anything. Lost his appetite. And, he had all of these things that, are all associated with COVID, right? And then he got well, right? After like 3 weeks, he got well. But he was still weak. And then eventually he went back to work. And then boom, he ends up having to get rid of a kidney because they found a growth in his kidney. And I'm like, what? So now he's recovering from surgery from having lost a kidney. And that's what they're saying, that the people that recover from COVID, that whole long haulers, disease or whatever, or sickness, that they end up with all of these, after effects. And that the main organs are being attacked: the lungs, the heart, the kidneys, the liver, the brain, and so my primo ends up with having to have a kidney removed. And then my sister-in-law's dad got exposed. The nurse woman that was going to go take care of him tested positive and didn't tell the family and kept coming to work.
Oh my God.
And the man that she takes care of is like 92.
Oh no.
And so everybody was freaked out about that, and because eventually she had to tell, Hold on a second.
Sure, take your time.
So, that was another close call, right? So anyways, but that's as close as it's really gotten to me. I haven't, had anybody, closer than that. Well, my sister, thank God my sister, one of her best friends ended up getting it. And in fact, she wanted to come see my sister, like right around the time that she got sick. She had wanted to come see my sister because my sister's pet from like 7 or 8 years died. And so my sister was really bummed out and stuff. And that day I went to go spend the day with my sister, and both of us wore our masks and we stayed really apart from each other. But, I just felt so bad for her. I didn't want her to be alone, and so I did stay with my sister that day. And she said, she called me like 2 days later saying that her friend wanted to come spend the day with her too that day. And she kept telling her, no, it's okay. My sister's here. I'm all right. You don't have to come, And that's I'm sorry, my ringtone.
No.
And so anyways, So 2 days later, her friend tells her, I have COVID. And so she goes, if I'd have told her to go ahead and come over, I would have been exposed.
Yeah.
And so that was a close call. But anyways, that's as close as it's gotten, knock on wood, right?
What do you think people are doing right now, and what do you think people should change given the developments?
Well, I mean, I wish everybody would wear their masks, and I wish people would stay home. I mean, just until we get this thing under control, just stay home and don't expose yourself and don't expose others if you're sick. I just wish people would just do that and but
yeah, I told my family, because we're all very close and we're all very accustomed to hanging out together, but I told them we have to stay apart now so that we can be together later. That's what it's come down to, is if we stay apart now, then we're taking care of ourselves to ensure that when we get the vaccine, that we'll be alive to get it, that we'll be able to get together again. Patricia, finally, this is the last question I'll ask you. What advice would you give yourself, having learned everything you learned during these last 8 months of pandemia? What advice would you give yourself pre-pandemic?
Like if I knew this was going to happen?
Just if you could just go back in time and give yourself information pre-pandemic, what information would you choose to give yourself to prepare?
Well, I certainly would have loved to have known about this in January or even in December, because I think people knew already, like in late December, right? And I wish we would have known since way back then that there were things that we could do, that there were things that we could, help ourselves with, and I feel like, we should have been told, and we should have been planning and preparing and doing everything that we could to stop this thing, to prevent it from getting this far out of hand. And I think we would have had a much better chance at not losing, already close to 300,000 lives, right? And I feel like we haven't even had a chance to mourn those 300,000 lives lost in our, country. And that's a lot of devastation for a country to go through. And you don't even get a chance to mourn it, as a country. I feel like that's a big, big impact that's going to imprint on our country. And I just wish, that we would have known so that we could have been better prepared. And that's it. I just.
Thank you for sharing your experiences, your thoughts and your ideas around these questions. These are important experiences to record, to keep for future generations, so that we can look back, and because 2020 is going to be one of those years that we talk about well into the future. It's been an incredibly trying and, like you say, devastating year for so many of us. Patricia, would you like to share any last thoughts before I wrap up?
Well, just that this pandemic has exposed so many of our weaknesses in this country as a country, as a people. And I hope that we're learning, like learning how valuable teachers are for our children, learning how valuable healthcare workers are. I'm afraid that we're not gonna, we're just gonna end up killing all of them, the way people are acting. And that's a tremendous profession. And those are tremendous skills and knowledge, that people, work very hard to get and build up and strengthen and, reinforce. And it's like almost as if, how can we not value that? How can we not value, what our healthcare workers are doing? How can we not care, and continue to expose ourselves, to the point where there's places now that they don't have enough healthcare workers to serve the beds, the filled beds. And then, what's going on with our schools and our kids' teachers. And, and they've always been on the lower end of the pay scale, and I hope that we're seeing how important and how valuable they are to our, for the lives of our children. And that when we come out of this, we reprioritize, all of these frontline people that, need to be out there continuing to do what they're doing in the face of such a horrible situation. And that we begin to value, the importance of, physical contact and physical touch and relationships and, all the things that we're being so deprived of. And I just hope that we take the time to recognize all of these things that we're having to do without because of this pandemic. And when we do get rid of it, that we have a completely different attitude and understanding of how valuable and important all those things are for us, for our communities, for our children's future. I mean, I don't have children, and I'm okay with that, but I think about all these parents. What must they be feeling for the future of their children, And it's just very scary and very sad. And I hope this experience is also a learning experience. It's been a terrorizing experience, but I also hope that it's a learning experience and that it really opens our eyes to what really is important, what really is valuable, what really matters in our world. Because, man, if we don't open our eyes, we're doomed. We're doomed. And, this really is, I was laughing the other day because they were talking about, well, how are people going to do a hookup, to have, people are needing to have sex and everything. Right. And I'm like, and they're saying, well, just do it and wear a mask. And I'm like, oh my God, how terrible. Right? And that is so sad.
But we got to find that humor in some some of this darkness, right?
Right?
Patricia, thank you so much for.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful reflection, and that's wonderful, beautiful and painful reflection, I know. And that's wonderful advice to remind us to take stock of what we do have and to value it, because gosh, if anything, walking away from this experience with that perspective, that is a positive thing.
Absolutely.
Thank you again for
You're welcome.
participating in this important project. I appreciate your time, and I hope that
my dog is calling on my attention now.
I see the tail.
Did you see him?
Yes. Oh my goodness. But yes, I hope that we honor your story and share it as you wish. So I'll be in touch about anything moving forward, and I'll be sending you the donor agreement form.
All right.
Okay.
I'll be
Thank you so much.
All right. Good to see you, Leticia.
See you too.
Spend time with you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.